One APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt.
Hi there. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lisa Lynn Chapman. And before working with Battleborn Progress, I spent 22 years in the anti-violence movement, focusing on domestic and sexual violence. I am very honored to be here hosting this show during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I'm also very honored to be joined with 3 knowledgeable experts to talk about domestic violence. Tonight, we have with us Serena Evans, who is the policy director with NCE DSV, an agency that I used to work with. Kristen Kennedy with the Domestic Violence Resource Center in Reno, and Tiffany Frazier with Safe House in Southern Nevada, Henderson. So also just wanting to make sure people know a little bit about why we're having this conversation. Obviously, domestic violence is a huge issue in Nevada. The Violence Policy Center releases an annual report when men murder women. This year, it reviewed the statistics over the last 25 years. And the report states that over that time, Nevada has ranked in the top 10 states with the highest murder rate of men murdering women over 23 of the 25 years. Additionally, Nevada ranks 21st in the number of households with firearms. And I'm starting here because when there is a firearm in the home and domestic violence, the risk of homicide increases about 5 times. And so while we have some things in place like universal background checks, it's not universally followed throughout Nevada, even though it is law. And so we have a lot of policy things to talk about, as well as how do we as a community come together, and how do we as a state come together and support victims and also work to end domestic violence in our homes. So I want to start with Serena. So Serena, in your experience, what are some of the key policy challenges that Nevada faces when it comes to addressing domestic violence?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. It's so nice to be here with you all. I'm Serena Evans. I'm the policy director for the Nevada Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening. And so when I think of policy challenges in Nevada, I think of a few key things that come to mind. The first being is that we tend to be really reactive instead of proactive in terms of policy implementation. So we enact all of these policies to punish perpetrators and protect victim survivors and push them through the criminal justice legal system after they have already become a victim survivor or a perpetrator, instead of focusing on policies that would prevent the violence from occurring in the first place. Another key challenge that we face is when we're working with policymakers, no policymaker will flat out tell you to your face, like, I don't support domestic violence. In fact, a lot of them boast that I really want to end violence and I really want to support victim survivors. Yet, if you look at their voting record, they routinely vote against policies that will decrease violence in their communities, and things like housing, access to education, things like sex education and relationship education in schools. And so they flat out vote against things that would directly reduce violence in their communities. And then specifically in Nevada, one of the key policy challenges that we face is that we are one of the very few states that refuses to fund prevention and intervention in our general budget. So many other states fund domestic and sexual violence in their general budget. We do not. And so a lot of our programs struggle to make ends meet, and we do not have enough funding in the state to meet the need of victim survivors. And I would say that those are kind of what I see day in and day out happening in my world of policy.
I absolutely agree with you. And it is a huge shame that Nevada doesn't fund preventative services, because we all know that prevention saves a lot more money than intervention or also incarceration or anything else like that. And so, again, our priorities are rarely focused where they need to be in preventing. Do either Kristen or Tiffany, do you have anything that you would like to add to that?
I think that Serena covered it pretty thoroughly, and the Domestic Violence Resource Center definitely agrees with the points that she made.
I was going to say, she hit it right on the nail. Like everything she said was perfect. So
Fantastic.
yeah.
So I'm going to stay on policy for just a little bit, and then we're going to talk about domestic violence in our communities and also what the victim survivors do. So if you have any questions or anything that you want to add when we're talking around policy, please feel free to add in. And also, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and they'll get them over to us, and we'll definitely make sure our panelists can answer those questions. What are some of the recent, Serena, what are some of the recent policy changes that happened over the last legislative session that are coming in to play right now, and how are they working?
Yeah, so there was a handful of bills addressing domestic violence. I think the first one that comes to mind is Assembly Bill 51. And among other things, there were some things around victim advocate training. But one of the things in that bill is it increased the time frame for arrest for domestic violence from 24 hours to 7 days. So what we were hearing was happening is that police and law enforcement were being dispatched to calls for domestic disturbances, and upon arrival, the perpetrator had fled the scene. So they only had this 24-hour time period to arrest the perpetrator, which is relatively short. And anything outside of that 24 hours, they would have to go and get an arrest warrant. And because of many, many factors, sometimes these arrest warrants were taking up to 6 months to be approved. And so it was leaving these victim survivors vulnerable. It was leaving them without the possibility of police intervention unless there was another incident of domestic violence. And so increasing this time frame gives law enforcement the ability to intervene without having to go through that lengthy arrest warrant process. And so when an individual is arrested for domestic violence, they then have a mandatory 12-hour hold. And this 12-hour hold can be vital for victim survivors, allowing them to apply for and then have issued an emergency protection order, seek safety, whatever it is that they need to do in that 12-hour period. And so this bill really allowed for those who choose to call the police to have a longer period of accountability for their perpetrator. Another bill that I'm thinking of is Assembly Bill, 257. Sorry, I had to think about that for a second, which requires that forensic exams now have to provide strangulation exams to victim survivors at free of cost. So what was happening before is that after an incident of strangulation, a victim survivor would typically often go to the emergency room, and a strangulation exam would cost them anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000 out of pocket. Insurance often didn't cover this. So many victim survivors were choosing to go without receiving a medical exam after an instance of strangulation. And those who work in this field know that strangulation comes with extreme health risks, the risk of a traumatic brain injury, as well as it increases their lethality risk. And so getting that intervention and that medical exam is really necessary to get them the resources as well as to help them identify some potential health risks to keep them healthy. And so now a victim survivor can go to any place where they do a forensic medical exam, and the same nurse has to conduct a sane exam free of cost to the victim survivor. And while criminal justice is not, the main scope of this bill, it does also play a role in the prosecution of strangulation. We are seeing numerous strangulation cases be thrown out and or the perpetrator being allowed to enter into a plea bargain because there was no good evidence around the strangulation. So those are two bills that have gone past the 2023 legislative session and are in effect now, and we're hopeful that they're going to have some very positive impacts for victim survivors.
Those are some amazing changes and some very needed changes. I remember working with some survivors who had dealt with strangulation, and it is, and so many have lost, many who have been because of strangulation. And so it is I'm very hopeful that these are going to make some really positive changes. Kristen, I want to ask you a little bit about the Domestic Violence Resource Center and what do you all do in Reno and in addressing domestic violence in our community, and tell us a little bit about your programs and what you do.
Sure, great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. These conversations are so very important. So the Domestic Violence Resource Center has actually been in Washoe County for 46 years. We used to be called the Committee to Aid Abused Women, or CAW, and changed our name in 2017. But in essence, what we do, on one hand, we provide emergency services to anybody that's fleeing from a domestic violence situation. So that might include shelter, temporary protection order assistance, safety planning, pet boarding, any of those necessary provisions that you might need, like when you're fleeing at a situation and you don't, think to take your toothbrush, like all those things we provide. But then on kind of the other hand, or on the more longer term side of things, we assist in helping individuals rebuild their lives. And so we do this through, we have a transitional housing program so individuals can be in our program and live in our housing for up to 2 years. And during that time, we do some very intensive financial coaching with our clients and trauma counseling. And we focus on those wraparound services that are maybe a little bit more ongoing. And then also our agency participates in a lot of trainings and prevention education. We work with law enforcement to do trainings. We work with youth groups. We have support groups that are open to the public. And then, of course, we like to be involved in the policy and advocating for policy as well. So we are a member of the coalition, the Nevada Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. And whenever, Serena calls upon us to help out during the legislative session or other times throughout the year, we're always happy to participate and help. So that in a nutshell is kind of what we do.
Fantastic. That is, I hope people who are listening in the Reno area, how can people get in touch with you? I always want to make sure people know what those hotline numbers are.
Yeah, thank you. That's real important. Our hotline is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The number is 775-329-4150. And just give us a call. We're open. We're on Vassar Street, 1735 Vassar Street. We're open Monday through Friday, 9 to 4. And you don't need an appointment. We have advocates here. You just come in. There's no wait list. We usually can see you right away. So we're here to support. And the other thing that I do want to mention, I think sometimes there's this misconception that you have to be in a crisis situation to come and talk to us. And really, that's not it at all. So if you know somebody or you're in a situation where you just want to learn more or get some advice, we're here to just have a conversation and kind of explore maybe what you're thinking or provide some resources and education as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for being such a strong resource in the Northern Nevada, Reno area. Tiffany, I know Safe House has a lot of the same services as DVRC does. So I'm going to ask you a little different question. What are some of the most common misconceptions or misunderstandings around domestic violence that we need to address? And because we always hear so many different myths and things like that. So what are some of those that you can think of?
Sure. So, first, thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor to be here. Actually, Kristen kind of touched on it a little bit when she talked about DV in terms of it not always being a crisis situation. And I think one of the basic or more common misconceptions is that um, domestic violence is not just what you see on social media. It's not just what you see on television. But when you think about domestic violence, you kind of have to think about it on a spectrum. So you may have on one end, there's behaviors that would be considered coercion, but not necessarily illegal. And then on the other end, you may have behaviors that are clearly illegal and assaultive behaviors. So, for example, if somebody throws a set of keys, now that's not necessarily illegal, but for the victim, it doesn't take that much to for something to be meaningful in terms of a threat or intimidation. Or if you're in a relationship and that person says, I don't want you hanging out with your friends anymore. If you really love me, you would stop hanging out with your friends and spend more time with me. Now, like I said, clearly that's not necessarily illegal, but it's coercive. It's intimidation. Now, if you take that same situation and that person says, I told you not to hang out with your friends, they're a bad influence, and that person follows up with a punch or strangulation, that's clearly illegal and it's assaultive behavior. And so I think we have to get out of the thing that domestic violence is not just always crisis. It's not always escalating. And one way that I heard is that it's not a bad day every day for the victim. And so we have to define the narrative in terms of that it can be on a spectrum. It's not just physical, but there is sexual, there's financial abuse, there's spiritual abuse as well when it comes to domestic violence, verbal, emotional, and I mean, stalking, neglect. All of these things are part of what it is involved in terms of domestic violence. And so I think when I'm talking about it and I'm out there educating the community, that is one of the most common questions that I get asked in terms of, or when I'm asking them, what does domestic violence look like to you? Most individuals refer it to more of the physical versus, all of the other elements and components that make a relationship harmful or abusive.
I absolutely agree. And the other one of the biggest misconceptions that I've always seen is that this is an anger problem.
Yes.
And it is not.
It's not.
This is a coercive problem, and it
Yes.
is a manipulation problem, and it is about power and control.
Yes.
If it were a anger issue, then a perpetrator would be angry and hitting everybody.
Anybody.
But it isn't. It's very specific to their partner and to that family unit. And so that's always one of the biggest misconceptions. Unfortunately, we also see it play out so often in the legal field where someone gets put in for anger management versus to a batterer's intervention program or something else like that, when you get sentenced to something that isn't appropriate, because that's not going to help the situation. Also, Tiffany, if I can, real quick, because I know that we did talk a little bit about DVRC and their programs. What other programs do you have? And also make sure that you let everyone know the hotline number there for you all as well.
Sure. So at Safe House, we provide, of course, we have our emergency services where we have a a 62-bed shelter. And within the shelter, we do have our hotline telephone number, which is, now read that out real quick. I never can remember it by heart, which I know sounds bad, but hold on one second. So our hotline is 702-564-3227. 702-564-3227. So within the context of our shelter, of course, we provide our clients with their basic needs. And also, we do have a transitional housing program that we just started or launched last year, because that was one of the challenges that we saw a lot with our clients when they came into our shelter, in terms of transitioning to be in their own places where they felt safe, and also having stable income. So we started that transitional housing program to help them with permanent housing. We also have our counseling department, and within our counseling department, all of our counseling services are offered to our clients for free. And it's not just for the clients that's in our emergency services, but anybody who has experienced domestic violence can call and do an intake, and we'll take them in, and those services are free for them and their children. We also just started our batterers intervention program too. Last month, I think, was the first month that we hosted our first session. And so it's going really well. And so we're thankful that we're able to start and launch that program. And of course, we have our advocacy department. So we have our advocates that actually go with our clients and go with them to court, and monitor the outcomes, helping our clients with the resources. So, for example, if they need help filling out a temporary protective order, we aid in the system with all of that, and including with their resources as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You guys just both organizations do such amazing work, and all of the programs throughout Nevada do amazing things. I really do miss going and visiting all of the programs. That was one of my favorite parts of my job. Serena, I'm going to come back to you. And both Kristen and Tiffany, and you brought up some of those intersectional issues around domestic violence, like housing and the economy. Can you expand a little bit more on that, and how we are looking at things policy-wise to make those kind of changes that are necessary?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics to discuss, actually. And so I think when people think of domestic violence policy advocacy, they really tend to go to the criminal justice system of like, we need harsher punishments. And for a lot of victim survivors, going through the criminal justice system is not at all what they want. They actively choose not to do that. And then, so in terms of like housing and economic justice and supports, that really is a means of prevention in our communities. And so access to safe and affordable housing, readily available, is one of the key ways we can decrease violence. And this has been recognized by the CDC of, the more opportunities someone has to leave an abusive relationship, the less likely their risk factors are. And so having affordable housing that, is easy to get into, that you're not on a wait list for 7 years, that can, meet your family's needs, allows individuals who have higher risk factors to be able to change their environment, as well as for victim survivors. It is often reported that housing is the number one reason that they don't leave. There's not enough shelter beds, despite our amazing programs throughout the state. There just isn't enough shelter beds. And outside of that, they can't afford to live on their own. So oftentimes with domestic violence is economic abuse. So they don't have savings. They have horrible debt. They don't have a job. And so they have all of these factors that are hindering them from getting safe and affordable housing. And so if we look at increasing well-paying jobs, decreasing housing screening in terms of if you have poor debt or poor credit scores, you can't get housing. Some of the systems that we have are just, quite frankly, just so meant to keep people in poverty and keep victims as victims instead of moving them to survivors. And so when we have robust paying jobs, we have jobs that have health insurance where people are able to afford childcare, they're able to pay their rent. They don't become dependent on someone to pay for these life-saving things to be able to just exist in society. And so if victim survivor does not have to become dependent on someone. And so a lot of times victim survivors stay with perpetrators, often for the sake of their children, because they cannot afford to live on their own. And so by decreasing these barriers, we ultimately decrease violence in our communities.
Serena, I want to follow up on one thing that you said that I thought was extremely interesting, and a lot of people don't understand, is that a lot of victim survivors choose not to go through the criminal justice system. Can you talk a little bit about that and tell us why someone would say, because the most logical thing is, well, call the cops and leave. Why doesn't that work for everybody?
Yeah. I think it's a deep question. I think there's a lot of systems at play there. First, the criminal justice system is not meant to support victim survivors. It is not victim-centered. It is not trauma-informed. And so working with the DAs, working with law enforcement, while they're all well-intended, they can often be re-victimizing and re-traumatizing and can often be really problematic. And then if a victim survivor does choose to go through a trial hearing, because domestic violence is now a trial hearing in Nevada, the judge doesn't have to receive any mandatory training on domestic violence, nor does the jury. And so you're kind of, domestic violence is extremely nuanced and it is not black and white. There's a lot of gray areas, and a lot of times a victim survivor doesn't present as the quote unquote perfect victim. And so the criminal justice system, quite frankly, doesn't side with them. And so it can be extremely traumatizing to go through this long, drawn out process where you have to tell your story over and over again and validate and seek validation that you are worthy of not being a victim, essentially. And so it can be really hard. As well as I would be remiss if I don't acknowledge that the criminal justice system is inherently racist. And so it doesn't work for Black and Brown communities, disproportionately affects them. And so when we look at the rates of domestic violence in our marginalized communities, going to the police is not always a safe option, nor do those communities have a whole lot of trust in our law enforcement. So I think there's a lot of factors at play, but, a lot of times there's also love there. The victim survivor doesn't want to see the perpetrator thrown in jail or have all these negative consequences. They really just want the violence to stop and for them to be able to live a successful life. So it's an extremely nuanced, complicated system, but it really is not meant to work for a whole lot of people.
Absolutely true. And because one of the things that I'm actually very blessed with being able to do, even though I have moved here to Battleborn Progress, is they still allow me to be an expert witness, which actually helps make the criminal justice system easier for victim survivors, because I can explain behaviors and things. They don't necessarily have to go on to the stand because they have an expert to come in and say, this is why these kind of things happen, and help that. And so that is one of the things that I'm glad I'm still able to do after 22 years. I can still do that. It's a really important part of making it a little more trauma informed. So Kristen would like to ask you about, can you share some of the success stories? Because when we talk about policy and things like that, we get a little wonky, and that's just kind of what we do. But you all do amazing work. And so can you share some of those success stories, how you have helped people transition from a victim into survivorship and thriving?
Yeah. So, we kind of had this shift in thinking. Well, I would have to say that when we purchased transitional housing units, that really kind of changed our model a little bit, because we shifted from just focusing on safety to focusing on safety and self-sufficiency. And also, really created this community within our organization, with our clients. And, I think for creating that community really helps to, decrease the chances of somebody going back to their abuser, and increases the probability of restoring the sense of agency and empowering individuals within that community when they have that support system. So our model kind of really changed, and I think this relates a lot to what Serena said about those economic justices, and we look to it like those social determinants of health, housing and employability and wealth and that sort of thing, to kind of guide us in our decision making. I think we learned a lot during the pandemic as well, that there was a lot going on with domestic violence during the pandemic, and there were some disparities about who was experiencing that and how that was being handled. And so we're really trying to focus on economic justice. And so some success that we've recently had, in the last 10 months, we have had 3 of our residential clients living in our transitional housing who originally came to us through our shelter program, came to us homeless because of domestic violence. All 3 of them purchased homes, and it's super exciting. And this is really a significant thing, because I think Tiffany touched on the fact that domestic violence isn't just that physical. There's a continuum, and there's a lot of different aspects to it. And so most of the time we see individuals come to us who have experienced, as part of the domestic violence, financial abuse and that control. So a lot of times people come to us without even a bank account, no job, poor credit because their credit has been ruined. Their abuser has, so many things that they can take out credit in their name, and, all kinds of things. So the 3 individuals, they in 2 years collectively saved over $50,000 for their different down payments on their homes. And one of them had a credit score. She increased her credit score over 300 points. And that really is because we have implemented a very intensive financial coaching program, and where our clients work one-on-one with a financial coach twice a month, and really goal setting and figuring out, what are all the things we need to do to get to a place where, we can live independently and break that cycle of abuse. And many other clients have gone on to be able to pay market rate rent. Maybe they didn't buy a home, but, transitioned out of our program into, living financially and mentally independent, because we do a lot of the counseling, trauma counseling as well.
That is so exciting. Those are the things that keep people going. People don't realize it, because I remember people saying, I don't know how you do it. It's so hard to hear all these stuff, but you don't realize is that you get some of the most amazing stories. Mm-hmm. And those are the things that keep you going in doing that. Tiffany, can you talk to us a little bit about how can our communities support victims of domestic violence? What are the best ways of doing that? And what kind of strategies do you use to kind of build awareness and support? And how do we support that?
Sure. So under the outreach and education, one of the primary responsibilities that I have is to go about in the community and to educate and to train community partners about the different aspects of domestic violence, not just the basics in terms of what it is, but also things such as bystander intervention, cultural norms and biases, and how that plays into domestic violence. Because I think one of the things that we really have to address, or one of the strategies that I really address, is really eliminating any type of cultural norms that we tend to associate when it comes to domestic violence, because that really can become dangerous for victim survivors, because when we start putting our own biases and our prejudice in the mix, then it really limits victim survivors from accessing resources and services. And so our primary responsibility is to really get the information and to educate our communities through community partners. So we partner a lot with homeless agencies. We have connections with other DV servicing agencies. We are a program member of the Nevada Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence as well. And so right now, one of our strategies is to really advocate for the youth. So building a youth program and partnering with youth centers, because we overall are seeing an increase in domestic violence across the valley. But we're also, we did a roundtable with the Henderson Police Department earlier this year. And what they did say was that they are seeing an increase in domestic violence or intimate partner violence within our youth, within our teens, teen dating violence. And so that's something that we want to get out the information out there to our schools, our educational institutions at all levels, including the college and university level as well. And so for anybody that's out there in the community, I would say the best thing that you can do is get educated and get the information so that you can know how to best support somebody who is going through a situation like domestic violence, so that you can be able to provide them with the resources, give them the hotline number, and just knowing how to be present and be available for somebody so that when they're ready to get help, when they're ready to seek that whatever it is they need, then you'll be that person who will be a resource to give them the information. So, yeah.
Fantastic. That is so very, very helpful, and actually leads to one of the questions from one of our audience members. What are some of those resources? Because you talked around teen dating violence and they were seeing an increase in it. And so what are some of the resources, all three of you, what resources are out there where people can, if they do have somebody or they know somebody who needs services because they're witnessing DV in their home, what's out there for them?
Well, I can jump in. So as the statewide coalition on our website, we do offer a find services in your area map, which is a great place to start. So if you go to ncedsv.org and you hit find help, it'll take you to an entire map of Nevada of who is providing services in that location. So rural Nevada, northern and southern. I think that's a great place to start. I also do want to point out that if you know that someone's experiencing violence in your life, the best thing that you can do is be there for them. They might not be ready to leave that relationship. They might not identify as a victim. They might not be willing to talk about it, but what you can do as a supportive person in their life is just validate them, let them know what they're experiencing is extremely hard. You're there to talk about it, but never push anything on them of like, you need to call this hotline, you need to go into shelter. That needs to be a decision that they make. And so really just being there for them. Being a victim survivor can be extremely isolating. You've had a lot of your autonomy taken away. So really giving them the power to make choices of if and when they're ready to seek services. But seeking out some of those resources is a great place to start. If they say, hey, I think I need some help, that way you can, take one thing off their plate of them having to research those things.
Absolutely, Serena. And I just want to say, one of the things that I learned in doing this work is I try not to ever give advice, but I do ask people, how can I support you? And that's the best thing. And if they say, well, if I need resources, if I need XYZ, whatever, then I can help do that. Or if they just need someone to sit and listen. Kristen, you wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, I just want to add, and maybe Serena can jump back in after me and give you more details on it. But in the last legislative session, there was a statewide committee that was formed for the response to power-based violence in schools. So I think in particular, when we're talking about youth and teens and, what they should do and what resources are out there for them, now, when somebody goes to their school counselor, the schools can and will and are required to provide just, here are other agencies that can support you. And this committee for the response to power-based violence in schools, it's brand new. So I'm hopeful that in the next couple years, or sooner than that, but until then, we'll have some great stuff for the next legislative session. So both Serena and myself sit on that committee. So we're working hard to hope to address some of these things when it comes to youth and schools and teens and all that.
That's exciting stuff. That is very exciting stuff. Another quick question, and this is something that Tiffany, you brought up about the culture and societal norms that contribute to domestic violence.
Mhm.
Can you expand a little bit on that? What are those? What do those look like?
Yeah, so I always like to give examples, and especially within the context of our culture here in America. Um, so let's say, for example, you have somebody who's married and they go through the process. And so a lot of times what will happen is that we will have judges that will literally reduce the charges. Let's say that something was a felony assault. But because of the cultural stigmas of you're married, so how can this be happening in a marriage? How can sexual assault or rape happen to somebody that you're married to? How can this be occurring? And so you will literally see them reduce something that was a felony assault to a misdemeanor. And so think about those things and how it makes the victim feel. Or even when we talk about extreme radical culture. So for example, like the Taliban and how they associate their culture and how they treat their women. So if we come into this place where we say, well, that's just their culture, that's just the way that they treat their women. Well, that's just what happens in a marriage. Or we become tolerable about what is a norm, then that's when we're talking about that it can create these biases and these stigmas to where somebody who's trying to get help, but they have these things in place where you're like, well, that's just a part of the culture. That's just the way that they do things. That's just a part of the system. And that can create these narrow and limited resources for somebody who's trying to come and they're trying to seek help. Because a lot of times if somebody grew up in these cultures and this is all that they know, but they know that something's not right and they're trying to seek help, when we place those cultural norms or we're saying, well, this is just the way it is, then imagine how that makes the victim feel. And so like I said, it becomes a dangerous thing when somebody who's trying to get out of that situation and they want to be safe and they want to come into their own. They want to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. They want to get away from the perpetrator. And so when that happens, we literally shut the door in their face. And that is the danger of what cultural norms, how that can come into play. And that's why I always, when I'm training advocates and volunteers, we always try to address, okay, are there any personal biases or perceptions that we have about different cultures, different races, religion, all of those things that we are hosting in our own minds, because we have to put it out on the table. Because when it comes to our victim survivors, I always say that everybody deserves to live in a house that is safe and that is free of violence and free of abuse, no matter where you come from, no matter your race, your religion, your sexual orientation, all of those things. Whatever demographic you're coming from, you deserve to be in a place that's safe. And that's what I really mean by, addressing those cultural norms too in society.
Absolutely. And as a society, one of the things that we have a really horrible habit of doing is we will in the white society we would say as an aberration, we will attribute as a cultural norm to Black and brown communities. And we do this all the time. One of my favorite law school journal people, Letty Volpe, actually wrote an incredible article called Blaming Culture for Bad Behavior. And that's really what it's about. It's about, we're going to take this and we're going to blame this culture for it. Like, and one of the examples she uses is underage marriage, where an older man is marrying an underage girl. And it was an aberration when it was a white person who was doing it, but it was just a cultural thing when someone, a migrant worker, did the same thing, and it became a cultural conversation. And those things are exceedingly dangerous. And we do, everyone needs to work on those kind of biases that we have when we're talking around victims and victim survivors. And I mean, and a lot of it is coming from one of the other part of that questions is how can we counter these cultural norms? And I think you said it perfectly, Tiffany, when you said everyone deserves to live in a home. It doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter what color you are, what you believe. Nobody deserves to be abused, and everyone deserves to live in a violence-free home. And I think that was a really perfect way of just encapsulating that whole concept and idea. So what I'm going to ask now is how. Also, I did want to say I'm very excited about the committee that is starting around teens. That is really exciting, because if we're going to stop domestic violence in our future, we stop it with our teens, and we teach people how to have healthy relationships when they grow up, and so that's a very exciting change that is happening, and an exciting way to address it. I'm thrilled about that. So. Gonna be, we talked about, and Serena, you brought this up, and I think was a great comment of what can family members do to help a loved one, which is be there. But what are you looking for? What are those warning signs, and how might you suggest? And this is Serena and Kristen and Tiffany. How would you suggest, if you think something's happening, saying something? How do you do this? And so who would like to start on that small question?
I guess I'll begin. Gosh, that's a tough one, and I think the most important thing is to be a non-judgmental ear. I think both Serena and Tiffany maybe touched on that, just listening, and instead of what you need to do type of thing, just understand that a victim needs to feel that their decisions are their own, that they are empowered to make choices. So when people come into our organization, we definitely we safety plan with them, but we don't tell them what to do. We say, here are options. And, we discuss kind of what it would look like with all those options potentially, but ultimately it's their decision. So I think, you kind of have to take that same approach of that non-judgmental, but it's important to know what those options are. Tiffany said that, that you have to be educated on where to go, even if it's just one number, or the national hotline even, or, or one agency that you're familiar with, just getting yourself familiar with that. And, you can maybe give some advice and make some suggestions, but in a very non-judgmental way, and I think just being a part of these types of discussions too is a great way to educate yourself. And yeah.
Absolutely. Serena or Tiffany, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I can add. Kristen hit it on the head too, and it's really about being there for that individual, but also I always like to add recognizing or watching out for signs or red flags. whether it's the person displaying like extreme possessiveness or jealousy over the victim begins to um, be more isolated from their family and friends, loved ones, manipulation, guilting the person, public humiliation, body shaming the individual. All of these things are signs, stalking the individual. And so that's why it's important to have these type of discussions, because the more that you're in the know about, okay, this is what domestic violence is, these are the red flags, then the more I am aware of how to support that person. And like Kristen and Serena said, it's not about saying you should do this, you need to do this. It's really about saying, hey, I just want to let you know that I understand what you're going through. I may not be in your shoes, but I understand your reaction. I understand how you may feel in a situation that is abnormal. So you may be feeling shame, you may be feeling guilty, you may be feeling all these things, but I want to let you know that this is a normal feeling to an abnormal situation. And I want to be here to support you however the best that I can. So you let me know how I can best support you. I'm not here to force you to do anything. I just want to let you know that I'm present and I'm here, and like we all said, giving them the information. I'm not telling you to use it today. I'm just giving you the information so that when you're ready to use it, that it's here, and that's what I always kind of like to reference to is it's really about giving them a toolkit and saying, you have all of these tools. You decide, you have the autonomy, you have your voice back to determine which tools you want to use out of this toolkit. So.
And one of the things that I always want to make sure that we make sure people know is that it is going to take a long time. And then it's going to take several times of leaving to leave for good. Often, most people say, oh, if they hit me once, I'm out, it's gone. It is not as simple as that, as people think. And it gets really frustrating on that friends and family side when you see somebody constantly going back and constantly going back, where you like, I give up. And one of the things that we ask you is don't give up on that person. Be the person who, for the 15th time, helps them pick up their pieces and say, how can I support you? And be there for them, because the 16th time may be that time that they leave. And so really we want to really be that person, because, and it's hard on the friends and family side too, because you don't want to see your loved one hurt and you don't want to see them keep going back, and it's hard to understand. And so calling the hotline and having those conversations, or meeting with someone and having that conversation as a friend and family to understand why someone keeps doing what they're doing. And you got to be careful, because when you say, well, you can't do this or you shouldn't do this, you're blaming them for a situation that is far more, and as Serena has said, nuanced than you're going to understand. Maybe they have been threatened by being murdered, or worse, threatened to be murdered after you see the kids being killed or someone's family being killed. Or maybe that threat isn't explicit, but it is like, we killed Fluffy the dog. Imagine what I can do to you. Those are the things that people don't see and understand, who are not inside those kind of situations. And so definitely just sitting and always just being present with somebody. We have 4 another person has asked an amazing question. And so I think we're going to close out with this one, because we've got about 4 minutes left. How do you assist somebody without getting dragged into a dangerous situation yourself? How can you best do that as a friend and family member? Kristen or Tiffany, I'm going to throw the Okay, one of you, please.
Well, Tiffany, please, I would be short. You know, we often say, you know, if you're feeling that the situation, you're dealing with a friend or family member, and it's a lot, you know, it can be overwhelming. And so if you can try and just suggest that somebody speak with an advocate who is trained and knows how to safety plan, I think that's how you're going to keep yourself most safe as a friend or family member, is to suggest, hey, you know, I'll go with you. Let's just see what they have to say. They might have some idea, you know. I think that's the best suggestion that I could have is to work with an advocate, because they understand all the elements of a safety plan and take into consideration your specific circumstance to help you develop what that plan might be. Because what we know is that it's not always leave right now. That might be the most, you know, leaving right this minute might be very lethal to the survivor. So I don't know, Tiffany, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, you hit it right on the head. It's really about giving them the information so that they can contact an advocate who is trained, who has the knowledge and the expertise to safety plan with them to determine if this is a right now situation that they need to leave, or can we safety plan with them over the course of the next few days or weeks or something like that. Because what we do know is that a lot of times when it comes to a person leaving, that it's mostly associated with fear, because when a person leaves, that potential for the escalated violence is increased. Most murders, suicides and murder, homicides related to DV has happened after the person has left the relationship. So that's why we say, give them the information, the number to the hotline, so they can talk with a trained professional who will help them through that.
And if I could just interject for 1 second too, is as family and friends, please don't ever call the cops on a situation without the explicit consent from the individual who's experiencing the domestic violence. Having the cops called doesn't necessarily mean someone's going to be arrested. And even if they are arrested, they're out 12 hours later. And that can significantly increase risk of homicide in the home, as well as just risk of future violence. So if you know someone that's experiencing domestic violence and they say, hey, can you call the cops for me? Absolutely, that's okay. But don't ever take that choice away from a victim survivor and assume that you should be calling the police. It can actually cause more harm than good.
So I think this is probably one of the best places that we can kind of wrap this up real quick. I'm going to do a quick around the horn. If everyone can give their website address and their hotline number, that would be fantastic. And then we will say good night. Kristen.
Our website is dvrcnv.org. And again, our hotline number is 775-329-4150. And I was trying to get my computer. We have a text line as well. And I don't know what happened to, I don't have that memorized yet. I'll come back to it if you want to go, Tiffany.
Sure. So our website is www.safehousenv.org. Our hotline number, it is 702-564-3227.
And I found that text line real quick for in the north. If you're in Northern Nevada, you can text DV Help or DV Safe to 839-863.
And Serena, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, so we don't provide direct client services, so we do not have a 24-hour hotline. However, we do have our website, which is ncedsv.org, and you can click on the Find Help button, and it'll take you to all the hotlines throughout all of Nevada.
Fantastic. And I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. I want to thank our wonderful panelists to talk about this important issue in Nevada and in our communities. And I want to say have a good evening. And enjoy your Nevada Day holiday if you have it off, although I do know that a lot of shelter workers will be manning those hotlines and they will not have that day off. But thank you all very much as well, and have a good night.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.